Virginia. August 4th, 1943. 6:17 in the morning. The salt spray stung like tiny needles against Greta Schneider's cracked lips. She tasted it, metallic, sharp, mixed with the diesel fumes rising from the harbor and something else. Fear, her own fear thick in her throat, coating her tongue like ash. The metal gangplank groaned under the weight of women descending. 15 of them, Wehrmacht-Helferinnen, auxiliaries. Not soldiers, they'd been told. Not quite. Just women who'd bandaged wounds in Tunisia, who'd typed reports in field hospitals, who'd served the Reich in ways that kept their hands mostly clean until the Allies came and decided clean hands still belonged to the enemy. Greta's boots touched American soil at 6:19. She had prepared herself for hell. The stories had been specific, detailed, whispered in the cargo hold during the 14 days crossing the Atlantic. American soldiers did things to captured women. Unspeakable things. The Geneva Convention was paper. Words. It meant nothing when men had power and women had none. They'd starve you first, weaken you. Then the rest would come. Greta had spent the voyage preparing her mind for death. Not the quick kind, the slow kind, the kind that strips away dignity before it takes breath. But the dock looked wrong. She blinked against the morning sun, trying to reconcile what her eyes reported with what her training had promised. The harbor stretched wide before her. Wooden planks weathered gray from ocean spray, warehouses lining the port, and beyond them, through the haze of August heat already building, she could see the city, standing, whole, undamaged. The cognitive dissonance made her dizzy. Or maybe that was just the 14 days at sea. Her legs felt unsteady. The world tilted slightly left, then right, like the deck still moved beneath her, though she stood on solid ground. An American MP waited at the bottom of the gangplank. Young, maybe 22. Rifle slung over his shoulder. He watched them descend with the bored expression of a man who'd done this 100 times and expected to do it 100 more. Greta waited for the shout, the blow. The beginning of what propaganda had promised. The MP yawned. He checked his wristwatch like a man late for breakfast. Another guard nearby said something Greta couldn't understand. And both men laughed. Actually laughed. The sound carried across the dock, casual and light, like this was an ordinary morning in an ordinary port doing ordinary work. No one hit anyone. The air itself tasted different. Greta pulled it deep into her lungs, and beneath the salt and diesel she found something she hadn't encountered in 8 months. Freshness. The smell of growing things, of trees thick with summer leaves, of earth that hadn't been scorched by artillery fire. A woman stood beside Greta. Helga, 42 years old, nurse from Hamburg. She'd spent the voyage silent, clutching a small photograph of her daughters to her chest like a talisman. Now Helga whispered in German, her voice cracking. "Look at the buildings, they're not bombed." Greta looked. Every structure stood complete. Windows reflected morning sun in neat rows. Roofs held their tiles. Walls showed no scars from shells or fire. Ships moved through the harbor with casual efficiency. Cranes lifted cargo. Workers called to each other across the water, their voices carrying the rhythm of routine labor, not the frantic pitch of a city at war. This was a port in wartime. She could see the military vessels, the uniforms, the organization that spoke of a nation mobilized. But it looked like a port at peace. In Germany, the cities were burning. Here, nothing burned at all. The guards gestured them toward a processing area. The women moved in tight formation, years of conditioning keeping them orderly, even in defeat, even in terror. Greta's hand moved unconsciously to the locket hidden beneath her collar. Inside a photograph. Annalisa. 12 years old, golden hair in braids, smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. Would they take it? The locket was small, brass, worthless to anyone but Greta, but worthless things could still be confiscated, destroyed, just because they could. She touched it once more, feeling the metal warm from her skin, and prepared to surrender it. The processing station sat under a canvas awning. Folding tables, metal chairs, American soldiers with clipboards checking names against manifests. One of the soldiers was a woman. Greta stopped walking. A woman, in uniform. Corporal's stripes on her sleeve, sitting at a table with a clipboard and a pen directing male guards where to position the new arrivals. Corporal Davis, the name was stenciled on her uniform, maybe 35 years old, dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, face weathered from sun and wind. She looked up as the female prisoners approached, her eyes moving across them with professional assessment. Not hatred, not contempt, just the evaluation of someone doing a job she'd been assigned. Greta's entire understanding of American military structure fractured in that moment. Women had authority here, actual authority. Men listened to them, obeyed them. The propaganda hadn't mentioned this. Corporal Davis pointed to a smaller tent off to the side. Medical processing. Female prisoners separate from male. Greta filed in with the others and a female doctor met them inside. Captain Richardson, maybe 40. Gray threading through brown hair, stethoscope around her neck. She spoke to them in broken German. "Remove your shirts. Medical examination. Standard procedure." The tent had been divided with canvas curtains, privacy, individual stations. The doctor moved from woman to woman, checking eyes, throats, ears, listening to hearts and lungs, making notes on charts. When Captain Richardson reached Greta, she paused. Her fingers found the old scars across Greta's lower back. 5 of them, thin white lines that had healed poorly. "Who did this to you?" Greta didn't answer, couldn't answer. The memory was too sharp. Tunisia, 6 months ago, a supply shortage at the field hospital. Greta had protested the way medical resources were being diverted to officers while enlisted men bled out on tables. The commanding officer had disagreed, had made his disagreement clear. German soldiers had done this, not Americans. Her own countrymen had taught her that protest earned pain. Captain Richardson's face softened. She applied clean bandages where the scars still showed slight irritation from the rough prison uniform. Her touch was gentle, professional, the touch of someone who'd taken an oath to heal and meant it. "You're safe now," the doctor said. The German was clumsy, the grammar wrong, but the intention was clear. Greta felt something crack in her chest, small, hairline, like ice beginning to thaw. After medical processing came photographs, fingerprints, prisoner numbers. Greta became 31-2847. The American photographer positioned each woman in front of a white sheet and snapped photos with mechanical efficiency. "Hold still," he said in English. "Don't smile." As if any of them would smile, but his tone carried no cruelty, just the weariness of a man doing repetitive work, like he'd rather be anywhere else, like this was boring to him. Boring. Processing enemy prisoners was boring to these Americans, not exciting, not vengeful, just tedious paperwork that kept them from lunch. The disconnect between expectation and reality grew wider with every passing minute. Then came the trains. Greta stood on the platform staring at them and felt the foundations of everything she'd been taught begin to crumble. These were not cattle cars, not the boxcars that had carried her across North Africa, packed 50 women deep with no seats and one bucket in the corner for bodily functions. Not the metal containers where women stood pressed together in their own waste and sweat for days. These were passenger cars, Pullman cars, with windows and cushioned seats and overhead racks for luggage they didn't have. An MP stood at the door, Sergeant Franklin Ashford, 35 years old if Greta had to guess. Thin face, kind eyes, he gestured them aboard. "Inside," he said. His German was better than the doctor's, almost fluent. "Long ride ahead, make yourselves comfortable." Comfortable. The word sounded obscene. Greta climbed aboard and stopped in the doorway, blocking the women behind her. The interior was clean, worn, yes. The blue fabric on the seats had faded from sun and use, but it was clean. The windows opened. Fresh air moved through the car, carrying the scent of American summer. She sat down slowly, like the seat might disappear if she moved too fast. The cushion gave beneath her weight, real cushioning. She could feel springs underneath supporting her body instead of pressing into bone. Beside her, Helga touched the armrest with trembling fingers. "This is a passenger train," Helga whispered. "They're putting us on a passenger train." Across the aisle, another woman ran her hand along the window frame. Margaret, 28. Radio operator from Berlin. Her voice came out hollow. "In Germany, I rode to the front in a boxcar. 60 women. 3 days. No seats. We took turns leaning against the walls to sleep." The train lurched and began to move. Through the windows, Virginia passed by in a stream of green. Fields rolled past, unplowed by tank treads. Farmhouses stood whole. Barns held their roofs. Cows grazed in pastures like the world was not at war. Like men weren't dying by the thousands across an ocean. Like cities weren't burning and children weren't starving, and everything Greta had known for 25 years wasn't collapsing into ash and blood. A child appeared in a yard beside the tracks. Maybe 7 years old, playing with a dog. The child looked up as the train passed and waved. An American child, waving at German prisoners. Greta lifted her hand and waved back before she could stop herself. The gesture felt like treason, against what she didn't know anymore. Against Germany, against the propaganda that had sustained her through 2 years of watching men die in field hospitals. Against the certainty that had carried her across the ocean. Sergeant Ashford walked the aisles checking on prisoners. His vigilance was casual, professional but not cruel. When he reached Greta's seat, he stopped and offered cigarettes around. American cigarettes. Greta took one. Her hands shook slightly as he lit it with a Zippo that clicked open with practiced ease. She drew smoke into her lungs and tasted tobacco that wasn't mixed with sawdust or dried leaves. Real tobacco. Pure tobacco. The sergeant moved on and Greta sat smoking, watching America pass outside her window. Feeling certainty crumble with every mile. The heat increased as morning stretched toward noon. The American South in August was an oven. But the windows stayed open. The breeze helped. Greta dozed, woke, dozed again. Sometime in the afternoon, the train stopped at a small town for water. The prisoners were allowed to step onto the platform, to stretch legs, to breathe air that wasn't thick with the smell of too many bodies in too small a space. An old woman appeared. She must have been 70, maybe older. White hair pulled back in a bun, cotton dress faded from washing. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth and approached the nearest guard, speaking to him briefly. He nodded. The old woman began handing out sandwiches to the prisoners. Greta took one, staring at it like an artifact from another world. White bread, ham, cheese, lettuce. An American civilian was giving food to German prisoners of war. "Eat," the woman said. The word came out in heavily accented German, like she'd learned it just for this. Just to say this one word to these enemy women. "You must be hungry." Greta bit into the sandwich. The bread was soft. The ham was real. The cheese tasted of something other than deprivation. She chewed slowly, and around her other women did the same, all of them silent, all of them trying to process what was happening. Helga stood nearby eating her sandwich with tears running down her face, not from sadness, from the sheer incomprehensibility of kindness from an enemy. The train whistle blew. They reboarded. The journey continued. Through the window, Greta watched America unspool in an endless reel of normalcy. Gas stations with cars waiting for fuel. Grocery stores with people walking out carrying bags full of food. Churches with white steeples pointing toward a sky that held no bombers. Every mile was evidence against the Reich's narrative. Every scene contradicted the propaganda that had sustained her through 2 years of war. Margaret leaned across the aisle, her voice barely audible over the train's rattle. "Do you remember the films they showed us in training?" Greta remembered. Films of American soldiers torturing prisoners. Films of cities in chaos. Films designed to make surrender seem worse than death. "I remember." "They lied," Margaret said quietly. "About everything. They lied about everything." Greta didn't answer. She was too busy watching a group of American children playing baseball in a field beside the tracks. Their laughter was audible even over the train's noise. In Germany, children hid in bunkers. Here they played games. The competing narratives in Greta's mind began to fight for dominance. Voice 1. The voice of training, of propaganda, of 2 years serving the Reich. This is a trap. They're fattening you for something worse. They need you weak, compliant. This kindness is a weapon designed to break your will. Voice 2. The voice of evidence, of eyes and ears and taste and touch. But the cities aren't bombed. The children aren't starving. The guards aren't cruel. What if everything you were told was a lie? The battle between these voices would define the next 2 years of her life. But in that moment on that train rolling through Virginia toward an unknown destination, Greta didn't know that yet. She only knew that she'd expected hell and found something else. Something stranger, something she had no framework to understand. Evening approached. The train had been moving for hours through Virginia, through the Carolinas, deeper into the American South. Heat pressed against the windows even as the sun began its descent. Greta's uniform stuck to her back with sweat. The train began to slow. Through the window she saw buildings appear, wooden structures freshly built stretching across cleared land. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter. Barbed wire caught the late afternoon light. A sign at the entrance read, "Camp Hearn," in white letters against dark wood. The train hissed to a stop. Sergeant Ashford stood at the front of the car and announced something in English. Greta caught only one word. Home. They filed off the train onto a gravel platform. The Texas heat was different from desert heat. Thicker, humid, it wrapped around her like a blanket she couldn't shed. Before her stretched the compound, and despite the wire and the towers, something about it looked wrong for a prison camp. Too organized, too new. American soldiers waited to receive them, but again their demeanor puzzled Greta. No shouting, no rifles pointed. One sergeant actually helped an older prisoner down from the train car, catching her elbow when she stumbled. The gesture was so automatic, so devoid of malice, that Greta stopped walking just to stare at it. Processing began immediately. More forms, more photographs. Another medical officer examined each woman. When he checked Greta's scars, he frowned. "These should have had stitches. You'll have a permanent scar." He cleaned them with alcohol that stung, applied fresh bandages, with practiced gentleness made notes on a chart. Greta stood there in an enemy medical facility, receiving better care than she'd gotten from her own field medics. The doctor handed her a slip of paper. "Report to the infirmary tomorrow. We'll check the healing." Greta took the paper. She didn't understand. This man was treating her like a patient, not a prisoner. Like her health mattered. Like her pain was worth addressing. Outside, twilight was falling. The prisoners were divided into groups and led toward the barracks. Greta walked with Helga and Margaret, following an American corporal whose rifle remained slung over his shoulder, unthreatening. They passed what looked like a kitchen building. Through the open door came smells that made Greta's stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. Meat cooking, bread baking, real food. The barracks loomed ahead, long, low buildings with screened windows and wooden steps leading to doors that stood open. The corporal gestured them inside. "Find a bunk, dinner in 1 hour." Greta stepped into the barracks and stopped. The other women behind her stopped too, creating a bottleneck at the door. The barracks was clean, newly built. It smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant, and down each side in 2 neat rows stood beds. Metal-framed beds with mattresses, with sheets, with pillows. Helga made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Beds," she whispered. "They've given us beds." Greta walked to the nearest unoccupied bunk and sat on it. The mattress compressed beneath her. The springs creaked softly. She ran her hand over the sheet. It was thin, institutional, but it was clean. A folded blanket sat at the foot of the bed. A pillow rested at the head, slightly lumpy but real. She lay back, staring at the ceiling, and felt springs supporting her body instead of dirt or metal floor. Margaret claimed the bunk above Greta. She climbed up and lay there in silence for a long moment before speaking. I spent 6 months sleeping on the ground in Tunisia. Before that, concrete floors in transit camps. Before that, a tent in the rain. I haven't slept in a bed since I left Berlin." Around them, other women were doing the same thing, sitting on beds, touching sheets. Some lay down immediately, others stood staring as if afraid the beds would disappear if they looked away. One older woman, a sergeant named Frida, who rarely spoke, sat on her bunk and wept quietly, her face in her hands. The hour passed too quickly. A whistle blew. The corporal appeared at the door. "Dinner time. Follow me." They walked to the mess hall in a loose formation. The building was larger than Greta expected, with long tables and benches and windows that let in the last of the evening light. American soldiers sat at some tables eating and talking. The prisoners were directed to their own section, but not separated by walls or guards. Just space, just custom. The serving line began at one end of the hall. Greta took a metal tray from a stack, picked up utensils, and shuffled forward. Behind a counter, American cooks in white aprons ladled food onto trays. Real cooks, not prisoners, not forced labor. American soldiers serving German prisoners dinner. The first cook dropped a piece of fried chicken onto Greta's tray. The second added mashed potatoes with a pool of brown gravy in the center. The third spooned green beans beside the potatoes. The fourth placed 2 slices of white bread with pats of butter on the tray's edge. At the end of the line, pitchers of milk sat on a table. Cold, sweating in the heat. Greta carried her tray to a table and sat. She stared at the food. Helga sat beside her, staring at her own tray. Margaret sat across from them and made no move to eat either. All 3 women looked at the fried chicken, the mashed potatoes, the butter, the milk, and could not begin. "This isn't real," Helga finally said. "If it is real," Margaret replied, "which means everything else was a lie." Greta picked up her fork. She cut into the chicken. Steam rose from the meat. She took a bite, chewed, slowly tasted fat and salt and seasoning, and understood in that moment that she was eating better food as a prisoner of war than she had eaten as an auxiliary in the Wehrmacht. Better food than her mother was eating in Stuttgart. Better food than Anneliese was eating. Better food possibly than she had ever eaten in her life. Around her, hundreds of German prisoners came to the same realization. The mess hall filled with the sounds of eating, but it was quiet eating, stunned eating. Some women ate mechanically, faces blank with shock. Others ate slowly, savoring each bite like it might be the last. A few couldn't eat at all, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of abundance in captivity. Frida, the older sergeant, sat with her hands folded, staring at her full tray. She hadn't touched her food. A younger prisoner beside her asked if she was still. Frida shook her head. "I'm thinking about my daughters. They're 11 and 14. In our last letter, they wrote that they had soup for dinner, just soup, potato peels and water, and I'm here in an enemy camp looking at fried chicken." The guilt was crushing, but the hunger was real. Eventually, Frida picked up her fork and ate. After dinner, they were shown the facilities. The latrines were clean with running water and actual toilets. The showers had hot water. Hot water. Greta stood under a showerhead that evening, feeling water hotter than she'd experienced in 2 years. Run over her skin, washing away sweat and fear and the grime of travel, and she couldn't stop shaking. Not from cold. From the slow, terrible realization that everything she'd been told about the enemy was wrong. By 9 o'clock, the compound settled into evening routine. Prisoners returned to barracks. Some played cards. Others wrote letters home, though they would be weeks in transit. A few ventured to the canteen, where they discovered they'd been issued 80 cents in scrip, enough to buy cigarettes or chocolate or soap. Greta sat on her bunk, trying to make sense of the day, trying to reconcile the America of propaganda with the America of experience. Sergeant Ashford appeared in the doorway of the barracks. He carried a small envelope in his hand and walked directly to Greta's bunk. "Miss Schneider?" She stood. "Yes." He handed her the envelope. It was sealed with red wax. Official. She could see stamps from the International Red Cross. "Don't open it yet," he said. His German was careful, precise. Wait until Christmas Eve. It's from the Red Cross. They deliver letters to prisoners on Christmas. It's already cleared. Nothing dangerous inside. Just news from home. Greta held the envelope like it might burn her. Inside this paper was news from Stuttgart, from her mother, from Annalisa. But it was August. Christmas was 4 months away. "Why wait?" she asked. Sergeant Ashford's face softened. "Because sometimes hope is better measured out. Sometimes it helps to have something to look forward to, something to hold on to when the days get hard." He left before she could respond. Greta sat on her bunk holding the sealed envelope. Around her, women prepared for sleep, removed boots, brushed hair, whispered quiet conversations in the dark. She touched the locket at her throat, Annalise's photograph still safe, still with her. Then she tucked the envelope under her pillow and lay back on the mattress. The springs creaked softly. The ceiling above her was clean wood. Through the screened windows she could hear cicadas singing in the Texas night. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind raced with questions. 7 questions specifically. 7 mysteries that would define the months to come. Would she survive whatever came next? Would Annalisa survive the war? Why did Sergeant Ashford look so sad when he saw her photograph? What was in the sealed envelope? Why did the guard at processing keep a photo face down on his desk? Why did American civilians show kindness to enemies? And the biggest question of all, if everything they'd told her about America was a lie, what else had been a lie? The questions circled in her mind like birds looking for a place to land. She had no answers, not yet, but she would find them, one by one over the next 2 years. She didn't know it then, but this first day in America would mark the beginning of a transformation so complete that the woman who climbed down from that ship at Norfolk would bear almost no resemblance to the woman who would stand at a graveside in Texas 29 years later, speaking wisdom earned through suffering and kindness in equal measure. But that was still to come. For now, on this first night in Camp Hearn, Texas, Greta Schneider lay in a bed with clean sheets and tried to understand how she had expected hell and found something else entirely. Something stranger. Something that terrified her more than torture ever could. She had found mercy, and mercy, she was beginning to understand, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Because it was very hard to hate people who gave you lemonade when you expected poison. Very hard to maintain certainty when every piece of evidence contradicted what you'd been taught. Very hard to cling to ideology when kindness kept chipping away at its foundations. The propaganda had prepared her for cruelty. It had not prepared her for this. Outside, the Texas night continued. Cicadas sang. Stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human wars and human suffering and the small revolutions happening in the hearts of women who'd crossed an ocean expecting death and found instead the terrifying possibility of hope. August became September. The heat did not break. Texas heat, Greta learned, was different from desert heat. It pressed down with humidity, made the air thick enough to taste. Salt and dust and the smell of cotton fields stretching beyond sight. The days established a rhythm. Wake at dawn, the compound came alive with the sound of whistles and boots on gravel and women moving toward the washhouses. Breakfast in the mess hall, eggs, bacon, toast with jam, coffee that was actually coffee, not the chicory substitute they'd drunk in Tunisia. Greta ate every morning and felt guilty every morning. While she consumed calories she didn't deserve, Annalisa was somewhere in Stuttgart eating potato soup, if she was lucky, if there were potatoes. The competing narratives in her mind grew louder. Voice 1. You're betraying them. Every bite of American food is a betrayal of your sister, your mother, your country. Voice 2. But if you starve yourself, does that help them? Does your suffering in Texas ease theirs in Stuttgart? No answer satisfied both voices. After breakfast came work assignments. The Americans ran Camp Hearn with military efficiency. Prisoners who volunteered for labor details earned 80 cents per day in canteen scrip. Those who refused sat idle. Greta volunteered. She was assigned to kitchen detail initially. Peeling potatoes, washing dishes, work that kept her hands busy and her mind from circling the same questions endlessly. But after 2 weeks, a different opportunity appeared. Corporal Jackson, who managed work assignments, approached her during evening formation. "Schneider, you have medical training, yes. Field hospital, Tunisia, 16 months. Can you cook?" The question seemed unrelated to medicine. Greta hesitated. "Basic cooking, nothing fancy." "Good enough. There's a farmer needs kitchen help. His wife is struggling. Lost their son in Normandy. She can't manage the house alone anymore. You interested?" Greta thought of the sealed envelope under her pillow. The Red Cross letter she wasn't allowed to open until Christmas. 4 months of waiting. 4 months of wondering if Annalisa was alive or dead. Work would help. Work always helped. "Yes, I'm interested." The next morning, a truck carried 6 prisoners 20 miles from Camp Hearn to a sprawl of farms that fed the war effort. Cotton mostly, some wheat, vegetables for the military supply chain. Silas Whitmore's farm sat at the end of a dirt road lined with live oaks. The house was small, white clapboard siding, green shutters, a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Behind it, fields stretched toward the horizon in neat rows of cotton ready for harvest. Silas stood waiting in the yard, 52 years old, weathered skin from decades under the Texas sun, thin in the way men get when grief steals their appetite. He wore denim overalls and a hat pulled low against the morning glare. He studied the prisoners as they climbed down from the truck. His eyes lingered on Greta, and she saw something flicker across his face, pain maybe, or recognition of something he'd lost. "You're the one with medical training." "Yes, sir." "Good. My wife, she's—" He paused, searching for words in a language that wasn't his first. His German was rough but functional. "She's not well, not sick, just sad, very sad. You understand?" Greta understood. She'd seen this kind of sadness in the field hospital. The mothers who came looking for sons and found only graves. The wives who received telegrams and stopped eating. Grief that became a physical thing, a weight that crushed you from the inside. "I understand. You'll help in the kitchen, cooking, cleaning. She'll show you what needs doing. Just be patient with her." The house smelled of dust and neglect. Not dirty exactly, just unlived in, like someone had stopped caring whether things were tidy or not. Dishes sat in the sink, mail piled unopened on the table. Curtains remained drawn against the daylight. Miriam Whitmore sat in a chair by the window in the parlor. 48 years old, dark hair going gray at the temples, she wore a house dress that hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. Her hands lay folded in her lap, motionless. She looked up when Greta entered, and her eyes held nothing. Not hatred, not curiosity, just emptiness. Silas made introductions in English first, then repeated them in halting German. "Miriam, this is Greta. She's here to help." Miriam stared at Greta for a long moment. Then she stood and walked from the room without speaking. Her footsteps creaked on the stairs. A door closed upstairs. Silas removed his hat, twisted it in his hands. "She's not always like this. Some days are better. Just give her time." Time was something Greta had in abundance. 4 months until Christmas. 4 months until she could open the envelope and learn whether Annalisa still drew breath. She could give Miriam Whitmore time. The work was simple, familiar. The same tasks her mother had taught her in Stuttgart before the war. Wash the dishes, sweep the floors, prepare meals from the ingredients in the larder. But the abundance in that larder made her hands shake. Flour, sugar, real butter, eggs, ham, vegetables from the garden. More food in this one kitchen than she'd seen in 6 months in Tunisia. More than her mother and Annalisa had seen in a year. She made lunch, sandwiches, simple. She called up the stairs when it was ready. Miriam didn't come down. Silas ate alone at the kitchen table, and Greta saw how he looked at the empty chair across from him. How his jaw tightened. How he forced himself to take bites of food that clearly tasted like ash. After lunch, he returned to the fields. Greta washed dishes, and then, because she didn't know what else to do, she cooked. She made stew. Beef and potatoes and carrots and onions simmered low in a heavy pot. The smell filled the house, rich and savory and alive. At 4 o'clock, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Miriam appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the pot on the stove, at the bread Greta had baked cooling on the counter, at the table set for two. "You made extra," Miriam said. Her English was accented but clear. "Yes." "Why?" Greta didn't have a good answer. She'd cooked the way her mother had taught her. "You always made extra, because you never knew who might need feeding, because hospitality was not negotiable even in wartime, especially in wartime." "Habit," she said finally. Miriam stared at her for another long moment. Then she sat at the table. She didn't speak while Greta served the stew. Didn't make eye contact, just ate slowly, mechanically, like someone forcing herself to complete a necessary task. But she ate the entire bowl. When Silas came in from the fields at sunset, he found his wife sitting at the table and Greta washing dishes, and his face did something complicated. Relief and pain and gratitude all mixed together. That night, riding back to Camp Hearn in the truck, Greta touched the locket at her throat and wondered what Annalisa had eaten that day. Wondered if there had been enough. Wondered if her sister was growing thinner while she, Greta, grew stronger on American food. The guilt never left, but the work continued. 3 times a week she went to the Whitmore farm. The pattern repeated. Miriam upstairs, Greta cooking. The smell of food drawing Miriam down. Silent meals. Small progress measured in clean plates and fewer unopened letters on the table. Silas never asked Greta to do more than kitchen work. Never demanded. Never raised his voice. He paid her the same 80 cents the camp paid for labor, though he wasn't required to. He thanked her at the end of each day, and the thanks sounded genuine. The cognitive dissonance grew worse. This man's son had died fighting Germans. Greta had served the Wehrmacht, had bandaged German soldiers so they could return to the front and kill more Americans. Her hands weren't clean. She'd never fired a weapon, but she'd enabled those who did. Thaddeus Whitmore was dead because of people like her. And yet his father treated her with kindness. His mother slowly, painfully began to treat her like a human being instead of an inconvenient ghost. Voice 1. "This is manipulation. They're softening you, breaking down your resistance. Don't trust it." Voice 2. "But what if kindness is just kindness? What if some people choose grace even when they have every right to choose vengeance?" The voice grew harder to ignore. In October, Eleanor Ashford began teaching English classes at Camp Hearn. 3 evenings a week, voluntary. 20 women attended the first session, Greta among them. Eleanor was 61 years old, silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She'd been a schoolteacher in Houston for 30 years before retiring. Now she drove out to the camp twice a week in her Chevrolet, bringing textbooks and patience. She taught them simple phrases first. "Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Please, thank you, you're welcome. I am sorry for your loss." That last phrase landed differently than the others. Eleanor had them practice it over and over. The pronunciation, the cadence, the slight softening of the voice that conveyed genuine sympathy. After class, Greta approached Eleanor's desk. "Why teach us that phrase specifically?" Eleanor looked up over her reading glasses. Her eyes were kind but direct. "Because you'll need it. Americans have lost sons and husbands and brothers. You'll encounter their grief. Being able to acknowledge it, to speak to it even in simple words, that builds bridges. What if they don't want bridges? What if they want revenge?" "Some do," Eleanor admitted. "Some people let grief turn to hatred. But most people, given the choice between bitterness and healing, will choose healing, eventually. If someone shows them it's possible." She packed her textbooks into a worn leather satchel. "My brother is one of the guards here, Sergeant Franklin Ashford. He lost his fiancée 3 years ago. Car accident, senseless, random. It nearly destroyed him, but he chose to keep living anyway, to keep finding meaning. That's what I'm trying to teach you, how to keep living. How to find meaning again after everything you've known has fallen apart." Greta thought about the sealed envelope under her pillow. About Annalise. About the not knowing that ate at her every night. What if the meaning is already gone? What if there's nothing left to find? Eleanor's face softened. Then you build new meaning, from whatever materials you have left. It won't be the same as what you lost, but it can still be real, still be worth holding on to. She left and Greta stood in the empty classroom thinking about bridges and meaning and whether either was possible when the foundation beneath you had turned to ash. She met Liesel Becker the second week of October. Liesel was 28, tall, blonde, sharp-featured in a way that made her look severe until she smiled and then her whole face transformed. She'd been captured in Italy, transferred through the same processing system that had brought Greta to Camp Hearn, but Liesel was different from the other prisoners. She spoke English fluently, had learned it from her grandmother who'd emigrated from Pennsylvania to Germany in 1910. She worked as an interpreter for the American Guards, helping translate orders and resolve disputes. Some of the prisoners hated her for it, called her a collaborator, a traitor. Ingrid Volker was the loudest voice in that chorus. Ingrid was 32, hard-faced, sharp-eyed. She'd been Gestapo in Munich before the war, party member since 1935, a true believer in ways that made even other Germans uncomfortable. She'd formed a small group within the camp, 7 women who met in corners of the barracks and spoke in whispers about loyalty and betrayal and what would happen after the war when accounts came due. Greta avoided them, kept her head down, did her work. But Liesel sought her out anyway. It happened in the laundry room. November rain drummed on the tin roof while Greta scrubbed mud from work dresses. Liesel appeared beside her with a basket of her own washing. "You're the one who works at the Whitmore farm." It wasn't a question. Greta nodded. "How is it working for someone whose son died fighting us?" "Complicated." Liesel laughed. It was a genuine sound, not bitter, just amused by the understatement. "Everything's complicated now, isn't it? I spend my days translating for American Guards, helping them understand German prisoners, helping German prisoners understand Americans. Both sides think I'm betraying the other." "Are you?" "I'm trying to keep people alive," Liesel said. "The war is over for us. We're here until it ends for everyone else. I can spend that time nursing grudges and maintaining hatreds, or I can try to make the captivity bearable. I chose bearable." She wrung water from a shirt with practiced efficiency. "Ingrid Volker and her group. They've been watching you. You know that, right?" Greta's hands stilled in the wash water. "Why? Because you learn English. Because you work for Americans. Because you don't join their little loyalty meetings. To them, that makes you suspect. I'm not betraying anyone. I'm just trying to survive." "I know, but to people like Ingrid, survival looks like collaboration, especially when it involves kindness from the enemy." Liesel finished her washing and picked up her basket. Before she left, she touched Greta's shoulder gently. "Be careful. They're dangerous. More dangerous than the Americans because the Americans follow rules. Ingrid doesn't." She left Greta alone with the rain and the smell of lye soap, and a new fear curling in her stomach. The fear proved justified. Mid-November, evening formation. Ingrid approached Greta outside the mess hall. 4 other women flanked her, hard faces, cold eyes. "We need to talk, privately." They walked to a corner of the compound where the lights didn't quite reach. Greta's pulse hammered in her throat, but she kept her face neutral. "You've become very friendly with the Americans," Ingrid said. Her tone was conversational, almost pleasant, which made it worse somehow. "I do my work, that's all." "You do more than work. You learn their language. You eat at their tables. You smile at their guards. The camp requires us to be civil." "Civil is one thing. Collaboration is another." Ingrid stepped closer. "Do you know what happened to collaborators in Germany, to women who were too friendly with the enemy?" Greta knew. Everyone knew. The photographs had circulated, women with shaved heads, public humiliation, sometimes worse. "The war will end," Ingrid continued, "one way or another. And when it does, we'll all go home. There will be a reckoning. People will remember who stayed loyal and who didn't." I'm loyal to my family, my sister, my mother, not to the party. The party and Germany are the same thing. No, Greta said quietly. They're not. Ingrid's face went cold. You should be very careful. Accidents happen in camps. People fall, get injured. Sometimes they don't recover. It was a clear threat. Greta felt ice slide down her spine, but she forced herself to meet Ingrid's eyes. Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. As a fellow German, choose your loyalties carefully. They left her standing in the shadows, and Greta returned to the barracks with her hands shaking. That night, Liesel found her sitting on her bunk. Ingrid talked to you. How did you know? She talks to everyone eventually, especially anyone who shows signs of thinking for themselves. Liesel sat on the bunk across from Greta. She threatened you? Yes. She's threatened me too, multiple times. The guards know. They've separated some of her group, but they can't watch everyone all the time. Liesel pulled something from her pocket, a small notebook, leather-bound, worn at the edges. I keep a diary. Everything that happens here, every conversation, every threat, I document it all. If something happens to me, I want there to be a record, want people to know the truth. Why are you telling me this? Because you're one of the few people here who sees things clearly, who understands that the propaganda was lies, that maybe, just maybe, we were wrong about some things. Liesel pressed the notebook into Greta's hands. If something happens to me, give this to the guards. Make sure they know. Nothing's going to happen to you. Liesel smiled sadly. I hope you're right, but Ingrid is getting desperate. The war is turning against Germany. She knows it. Everyone knows it. And desperate people are dangerous people. She left, and Greta sat holding the diary, feeling the weight of it, the weight of truth written down. Evidence that might matter or might simply be words that outlived their author. She hid it under her mattress and tried to sleep. December arrived. The heat finally broke. Texas winter was nothing like German winter, but the cooler air felt like mercy after months of humidity. Greta had been at Camp Hearn for 4 months. The sealed envelope still waited under her pillow. Christmas Eve was 3 weeks away. At the Whitmore farm, small changes accumulated. Miriam came downstairs earlier each visit. Sometimes she helped with the cooking. Once she asked Greta about her family. You have siblings, a sister, Annalisa. She's 12. What's she like? Greta thought about the photograph in her locket, about braids and smiles and a child who'd written letters about potato soup. Brave, braver than me. She takes care of our mother, keeps things running at home while I'm... She gestured vaguely. While I'm here, while I'm the enemy. Miriam nodded slowly. Thaddeus was brave too. He didn't have to enlist, could have claimed farm exemption, but he wanted to serve, wanted to fight. I begged him not to go. Her voice cracked on the last word. Greta reached across the table and covered Miriam's hand with her own. The gesture was automatic, human, the same thing she'd done 1,000 times in the field hospital when there were no words that helped. Miriam didn't pull away, just sat there with tears running down her face while Greta held her hand, and the stew simmered on the stove, and outside the December wind rattled the windows. After a long moment, Miriam spoke again. You look like her. Thaddeus's girl. Sweetheart he had back in high school. Same coloring, same age probably. That's why Silas hired you. Because he saw it too. Saw what we lost. I'm sorry, Greta whispered. I am so sorry for your loss. The English phrase Eleanor had taught her, practiced until it sounded natural, but nothing about this felt natural. This was pain meeting pain across enemy lines. Miriam squeezed her hand once, then released it. I know you are. I can see it. You carry your own grief. We all do now. That night riding back to camp, Greta felt something shift. Some small crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. The wall that said Americans were other, enemy, separate. But Miriam Whitmore's grief felt identical to Greta's own. Loss was loss. Pain was pain. It didn't matter which flag you saluted or which language you spoke or which side of the war you'd stood on. The dead were still dead. The living still had to figure out how to keep living. December 20th, 1943. The day everything changed. Evening formation had just ended. Prisoners were returning to barracks. Dinner had been chicken and dumplings. Greta's stomach was full. She was thinking about the envelope. 4 more days until Christmas Eve. 4 more days until she could open it and learn whether Annalise was alive. She climbed the steps to the barracks and heard voices inside. Angry voices, a scuffle. She opened the door and saw them. Ingrid and 4 others had Liesel cornered against the far wall. One held a metal pipe. Another held a board studded with nails, improvised weapons deadly if used with intent. Liesel's nose was bleeding. She held her hands up trying to protect her face. "Please, don't do this. I haven't betrayed anyone." "You translate for them," Ingrid hissed. "You smile at the guards. You tell them our secrets. I'm trying to keep us safe, all of us. You're trying to save yourself, traitor." The pipe came down. Greta heard the crack, saw Liesel collapse, saw the others close in their faces, twisted with righteous fury. She should have screamed, should have run for the guards, should have done anything except stand frozen in the doorway watching a woman being beaten to death. But fear paralyzed her. Voice 1 screaming, "If you help her, you're next." Voice 2 screaming, "Help her, help her, help her." The voices canceled each other out, left her silent. It lasted maybe 90 seconds, felt like hours. When they finished, Liesel lay on the floor in a spreading pool of blood. Her skull was cracked, both arms broken, breathing shallow and wet. Ingrid looked up and saw Greta in the doorway. "You saw nothing, understand nothing." Greta nodded mutely. They filed past her out of the barracks, and she stood there staring at Liesel's broken body until someone else came in and started screaming for the guards. The Americans came running. Medics, officers. They carried Liesel to the infirmary on a stretcher. Sergeant Franklin Ashford questioned everyone in the barracks. Greta told him nothing. Fear had stolen her voice. Or maybe it was shame. Maybe it was the knowledge that she'd stood there and watched and done nothing. Liesel died 6 days later. December 26th, the day after Christmas. The day after Greta finally opened the sealed envelope and learned that Annalise was alive. Thin, hungry, but alive as of October. The guilt of that timing would haunt Greta for the rest of her life. That she'd received news of her sister's survival on the same day Liesel died because Greta hadn't found the courage to scream. The Americans investigated, separated the known Nazi sympathizers. Ingrid Volker was sent to a different camp, a harsher one, maximum security, but it didn't bring Liesel back. 3 days after the murder, Sergeant Franklin Ashford found Greta sitting alone by the fence line staring at nothing. He sat down beside her, didn't speak for a long time, just sat. Finally, "You saw what happened." It wasn't a question. Greta nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was afraid. Of Ingrid. Of everything. Of speaking. Of staying silent. Of all of it." Franklin was quiet for another moment. Then he pulled something from his pocket. A photograph. He handed it to Greta. The woman in the picture was young, maybe 25, blonde, smiling. She stood in front of a church in a white dress. "My fiancée," Franklin said. "Catherine. She died 3 years ago. Car accident. Drunk driver hit her on her way home from the hospital where she worked. She was a nurse." Greta looked at the photograph, saw what Miriam had seen. The resemblance was slight but present. Same coloring, same general features. "Is that why you gave me the envelope? Why you've been kind to me?" "Partly, maybe. I don't know. I look at you and I see someone who could have been her. Could have lived her life if things had been different. If borders were drawn differently. If history had taken another path." He took the photograph back, studied it. "She used to say that hate was easy. Any fool could hate. But choosing kindness, especially when you had every reason to choose cruelty, that took real strength." He stood up, pocketed the photograph. You're not responsible for what happened to Liesel. Ingrid Volker is. The ideology that poisoned her mind is you were just trying to survive. That's not a crime. That's human. He walked away and Greta sat there thinking about Catherine and Liesel and Annalisa and all the women who should have lived but didn't and about the ones who lived but carried the ghosts of the dead everywhere they went. Christmas Eve arrived in all its complicated grief. The Americans decorated Camp Hearn with pine boughs and paper chains. There was a service in the chapel. Greta didn't attend. She sat on her bunk holding the opened envelope, reading and rereading her mother's letter. Annalisa was alive, thin but alive. The house had been damaged in bombing but still stood. They had food, not much. Potato soup mostly, but enough. Her mother's handwriting was shaky. Age or malnutrition, Greta couldn't tell. Maybe both. We think of you every day. We pray you're safe. We pray you come home. Annalise asks about you constantly. She still believes you're invincible. I let her believe it. Hope is precious now. We can't afford to waste it. Greta folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope. She should have felt relief. Joy. Her sister was alive, but Liesel was dead, and Greta was alive in a camp where she ate fried chicken while Annalisa ate potato soup. The guilt was crushing. Someone knocked on the barracks door. Greta looked up and saw Corporal Davis, the female guard who'd processed them on that first day. Schneider, you have a visitor. A visitor? The Whitmores, they're at the gate, asking for you. Greta followed the corporal to the main gate in a daze. What were Silas and Miriam doing here? It was Christmas Eve. They should be home, grieving their son in private. But there they stood beside their truck, Silas holding a paper bag, Miriam clutching a small wrapped package. We can't let you off compound, Silas said. His German was improving. He practiced every time she worked the farm. But we needed, to bring you something. He handed her the paper bag, inside a wool scarf, hand-knitted, gray and soft. Miriam made it, for you. Greta looked at Miriam, who wouldn't quite meet her eyes. Why? Miriam's voice was barely audible. Because you've been kind to me, when you had no reason to be. When I gave you nothing but silence and grief, you still came, still cooked, still sat with me in my pain. I needed to give you something back. She thrust the wrapped package at Greta. And this is from both of us. Open it tomorrow, Christmas morning. They left before Greta could respond, drove away into the December night, leaving her standing at the gate holding gifts from people whose son had died fighting her country. That night, lying in her bunk, Greta unwrapped the package. Inside was a photograph, the three of them, Silas, Miriam, and Thaddeus, taken before the war. He looked like his father, same thin build, same serious eyes. He wore his uniform, fresh pressed, proud. On the back, in Miriam's handwriting, Thaddeus would have wanted us to forgive, would have wanted us to choose love over hate. We're trying. Thank you for helping us try. Greta held the photograph and wept. For Thaddeus, for Liesel, for Annalisa eating potato soup, for all the dead and all the living and all the impossible, painful, beautiful ways they were connected across battle lines and oceans and grief. Outside, someone started singing. German Christmas carols in the barracks. American Christmas carols from the guards' quarters. The voices didn't blend, didn't harmonize, just existed together in the cold December air. Greta fell asleep holding the photograph and the scarf and the knowledge that the world was more complicated than any propaganda had ever suggested. That kindness could come from enemies. That guilt could coexist with gratitude. That healing was possible even when you didn't deserve it. That mercy was real. And that maybe, just maybe, the woman she'd been when she stepped off that ship in August was already dying. Being replaced by someone new. Someone who'd learned that the most dangerous weapon the Americans possessed wasn't guns or bombs or prisons. It was their stubborn insistence on treating the enemy like human beings. That was the thing that broke you. Not cruelty, kindness. Because it was very hard to maintain your certainties when someone whose son you helped kill gave you a hand-knitted scarf and asked nothing in return except that you keep living, keep trying, keep choosing hope over bitterness even when bitterness felt like the only rational response. The war continued, but inside Greta Schneider something fundamental had shifted. She didn't know it yet, but this Christmas would mark the turning point. The moment when Voice 2 finally grew louder than Voice 1, when evidence overcame propaganda, when transformation became inevitable. The hardest part was still to come. The war would end. She would return to Germany. She would face choices that would define the rest of her life. But on this Christmas Eve in 1943, in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, Greta learned a lesson that would sustain her through everything that followed. That the human capacity for kindness was stronger than any ideology, that love could survive war, that bridges could be built even across graves, and that sometimes the enemy had something to teach you. If you were brave enough to listen, if you were willing to let your certainties die so something truer could be born. Outside, the singing continued. German and American voices, separate but simultaneous. A discordant harmony that somehow, despite everything, despite the war and the grief and the impossible distance between them, sounded like hope. May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe ended with a radio announcement that crackled through Camp Hearn's speakers at dawn. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally, completely. Hitler was dead. Berlin was rubble. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. In the female barracks, some women wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few cheered quietly, privately, where no one could accuse them of betraying the fatherland. Greta felt nothing, just a vast emptiness where certainty used to live. The Americans began repatriation processing within weeks. Ships would carry them back across the Atlantic, back to whatever remained of home, back to the ruins. Silas drove to Camp Hearn 3 days after the announcement, found Greta in the garden where prisoners grew vegetables for the mess hall. "You're going back." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "When? September, maybe October. They have to organize transport." Silas removed his hat, turned it in his hands. The gesture was familiar now, what he did when words were difficult. "You could stay after. When the prisoner status ends, you could apply for immigration. I'd sponsor you. Miriam would too." The offer hung in the humid Texas air. Stay in America, leave Germany behind. Build a life here where the sky was wide and the food was plentiful and people chose kindness over inherited hatred. "My mother is there. My sister, they need me." "I know, I needed you to know the door is open if you ever want to come back." He left and Greta stood in the garden with dirt under her fingernails and possibility weighing heavy in her chest. The ship that carried her back to Germany left Norfolk in September 1946, 3 years and 1 month after she'd first arrived. The crossing took 2 weeks. Cold, uncomfortable, nothing like the Pullman cars and cushioned seats that had brought her to Texas. When they docked at Bremerhaven, Greta stepped onto German soil and found ruins. The port was a skeleton, cranes twisted into abstract sculptures by bombing, buildings reduced to shells. People moved through the streets like ghosts, thin, hollow-eyed, dressed in whatever scraps they could scavenge. She made her way to Stuttgart by train. A real train this time, not a prisoner transport, but the boxcar was crowded with returnees and refugees and displaced persons all trying to get somewhere that might still feel like home. The journey took 16 hours, should have taken 4, but the tracks were damaged. Bridges were out. They stopped and started and detoured around destruction. Stuttgart was unrecognizable. 85% of the city had been destroyed. The landmarks she'd grown up with were gone. The church where she'd been baptized, the school where she'd learned to read, the market where her mother had bought bread on Saturday mornings. All gone, reduced to rubble and ash and the smell of old fires that never quite left the air. She found her mother in a single room of a farmhouse 15 kilometers outside the city. The address had been in the last letter. Written in April 1945. Greta had received it in July. It had taken 3 months to cross an ocean and find her in Texas. Hildegard Schneider opened the door and didn't recognize her daughter for a full 10 seconds. Then recognition came and she made a sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a word, just a sound of something breaking and healing simultaneously. They held each other in the doorway and wept. Inside the room was small. One bed, one chair, a hot plate for cooking, a basin for washing. Everything they owned fit in 2 suitcases. Greta's eyes searched the space for what wasn't there. "Where's Annalisa?" Her mother's face crumpled. "She died. March 14th, 1945, bombing. She was at the market. We needed food. I sent her because she was small, could slip through crowds, get to the front of lines." Hildegard sat on the bed. Her hands trembled. "The bombs came during the day, no warning. American bombs, they hit the market directly. I found her. Eventually. It took 3 days. They'd piled the bodies, so many bodies I recognized her by her shoes." The room tilted. Greta sat on the floor because her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. When March 14th, 2 months before the war ended, 2 months, if they'd just 2 more months and she would have lived. The guilt that crashed over Greta was physical, crushing. She'd been in Texas eating fried chicken while Annalisa starved. She'd been sleeping in clean sheets while her 12-year-old sister scrounged for food in markets that became graveyards. She'd survived. Annalisa hadn't. What kind of universe allowed that equation? "I need to see her grave." Hildegard shook her head. "There is no grave. Not really. Mass burial, hundreds together. There's a marker, a stone, but no individual graves. No way to know exactly where she is." They went the next day. The cemetery was new, raw earth, simple crosses, and one large stone marker that read, "Here rest the victims of the March 14th bombing. May they find the peace that was denied them in life." Greta knelt in the mud. She pulled the locket from her throat. Inside Annalisa's photograph, 12 years old, smiling, alive in a moment frozen before the world ended. She pressed the locket into the mud in front of the marker, left it there, an offering, an apology, a prayer to a God she no longer believed in. She couldn't save her sister, couldn't even bury her properly, couldn't do anything except kneel in German mud and feel the weight of survival crush her from the inside. That night she read the letters, the ones Annalisa had written, the ones that had never reached Texas. Her mother had kept them. 3 letters, written between January and March 1945. The last one was dated March 10th, 4 days before she died. "Dear Greta, I miss you. Mother says you're safe in America. I'm glad. Someone should be safe. We had soup today. Real soup, potato and carrot. It was wonderful. I'm getting good at finding food. Mother says I'm a natural scavenger. I think that's a compliment. When you come home, I'll show you all the best places. The markets that still have supplies, the farmers who trade for services. I'm learning so much. When the war ends, I'll be so useful. Mother won't have to worry. I'll take care of everything. I'm 12 now, almost grown up. I can help. I want to help. Will you come home soon? I keep looking for you. Every day, every train that arrives, I look for your face. I know you'll come. You always come back. You promised. I love you. Your sister Annalisa." Greta read it 5 times, 10 times, until the words blurred and her throat closed and she couldn't breathe around the grief. Annalisa had died believing Greta would come home, would save her, would make everything better. And Greta had been in Texas, learning English, eating turkey, receiving hand-knitted scarves from the enemy while her sister starved and died in a market bombing. The guilt would never leave. She understood that now. This was the price of survival. You carried the dead with you, forever. She found work as a nurse at a Stuttgart hospital. The building had been partially destroyed, then hastily repaired. They had few supplies, fewer medicines, but people kept getting sick, kept getting injured, kept dying. Greta worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes 16, lost herself in other people's suffering because it was easier than confronting her own. In 1947, she met Werner Richter. He was 32, veteran of the Eastern Front. He'd lost his right leg below the knee to a Russian shell in 1944. Wore a prosthetic now. Worked as a clerk in a government office processing refugee claims. He was intelligent, educated, bitter. They met at a cafe, one of the few still operating in Stuttgart. Greta was drinking ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns. Werner sat at the next table and they started talking. He made her laugh. For the first time since returning to Germany, she laughed. They married in April 1948. Small ceremony. No family except Hildegard. No celebration. Just paperwork and a quiet dinner in their shared apartment. Leah was born in June 1949. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, blonde hair, blue eyes, perfect in every way that mattered. Greta held her daughter and felt something crack open in her chest. Something that had been frozen since March 14, 1945. Since learning Annalisa was dead. Here was new life, new possibility, a chance to build something from the ruins. But Werner was changing. Or maybe he'd always been this way and Greta had been too desperate for connection to see it clearly. He started attending meetings, political meetings, groups of former soldiers who believed Germany hadn't lost the war, had been betrayed, stabbed in the back by politicians and Jews and everyone except the men who'd actually fought. The old ideology, the old hatred, dressed in new words but meaning the same thing. He came home from these meetings energized, angry, talking about restoration and revenge and how Germany would rise again. Greta tried to argue, tried to show him that this path led only to more destruction. He didn't listen. Then he started drinking. Not much at first, a beer or two after work, but the amounts increased. The frequency increased. And when he drank, the anger came out. He never hit her. Not exactly. But he grabbed, pushed, threw things that missed by inches that felt like warnings. He shouted about her time in America, about how she'd been corrupted, softened, turned against her own people by enemy propaganda. You ate their food, he spat one night, wore their clothes, learned their language, while real Germans starved, while we fought and died and bled. I was a prisoner. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. You could have refused, could have maintained your dignity. Instead, you collaborated. The word hit like a slap. I didn't collaborate. I survived. Same thing, Werner said. To people like you, survival means surrender. He grabbed his coat and left, went to his meeting, came home drunk at 2 a.m. and passed out on the couch. Greta stood over him holding Leah and understood with cold clarity that she couldn't stay, couldn't raise her daughter in this house, in this anger, in this refusal to let the war end. The divorce took 8 months. Werner fought it. The courts were backed up with thousands of cases, housing disputes, property claims, custody battles, but Greta was relentless. She documented everything, his drinking, his meetings, his ideology, his violence. In March 1953, the judge ruled in her favor, full custody of Leah. Werner could have supervised visits if he completed alcohol treatment. He never did. She received the letter from Miriam in April 1953. It had taken 6 months to reach her. Forwarded through 3 addresses. The envelope was worn, stained, but the words inside were clear. Dear Greta, I hope this finds you well. I hope you and your family have survived the terrible years. Silas and I think of you often. We pray you found your mother and sister safe. We wanted you to know that you are always welcome here. Our home is your home. Texas is your home if you choose it. The sponsorship offer still stands. If you want to come back, we will help. With paperwork, with money for passage, with housing and work and whatever you need. You gave us something precious in our darkest time. You gave us hope that healing was possible. Let us return the favor. Please consider it. We miss you. All our love, Miriam and Silas Whitmore. Greta read it 3 times, held it to her chest. Then she made a decision. She would go back. Not because Germany wasn't her home. It was. Would always be in the way your first language is always your first language, even if you learn to think in another. But because she couldn't raise Leah in ruins, in bitterness, in the poisonous ideology that had killed Annalisa and millions of others. She couldn't stay in a country that refused to learn from its mistakes, that dressed old hatreds in new clothes and called it restoration. She would go back to Texas, to people who had chosen forgiveness when they had every right to choose revenge, to a place where her daughter could grow up without the weight of Germany's sins crushing her from birth. The paperwork took 2 years: visa applications, sponsorship documents, proof of employment waiting in Texas, character references, medical examinations. But in August 1955, Greta and Leah boarded a ship in Bremerhaven bound for New York. Leah was 6 years old, blonde braids, curious eyes. She spoke German and some English that Greta had taught her. "Where are we going, Mama?" "To America, to Texas, to people who love us." "Why do they love us? They don't know us." Greta knelt to her daughter's height, touched her face gently. "Because love isn't always about knowing someone. Sometimes it's about choosing to see the best in people, choosing grace over bitterness. They taught me that. Now I want to teach you." The crossing took 11 days. When they arrived in New York, Greta stood on the deck watching the skyline approach and felt her hands shaking. 12 years since she'd first seen America, 12 years since she'd expected hell and found mercy. She was different now, changed in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The war had broken something in her that could never be repaired. But it had also taught her things about resilience, about forgiveness, about the human capacity for kindness even in the darkest times. Silas and Miriam met them at the bus station in Houston. They'd driven 4 hours to be there when the bus arrived. Silas looked older, grayer, thinner, but his smile was the same, warm, genuine. Miriam had aged too, more lines around her eyes, more silver in her hair. But when she saw Greta, she started crying. They embraced in the bus station parking lot, held each other while Leah watched with wide, uncertain eyes. "Welcome home," Miriam whispered. "Welcome home." The farm hadn't changed much. Same white clapboard house, same live oak trees, same fields stretching toward the horizon. But there was a new tree, a small oak sapling planted near the porch. Miriam pointed to it. "We planted that the Christmas after you left, 1946. We wanted something living to remember you by. Something that would grow, thrive, a symbol of hope." The sapling was 9 years old now, taller than Greta. Its branches spread wide, leaves rustling in the August wind. Leah ran to it, immediately touched the bark with careful fingers. "Can I climb it, Mama? When you're bigger, when the branches are stronger." That night, sitting on the porch with coffee and the sound of cicadas, Silas told Greta about the years she'd missed. The farm had struggled after the war, labor shortages, price fluctuations, competition from industrial agriculture. But they'd survived, adapted, found ways to keep going. "Miriam is better," he said quietly. "Not healed. You don't heal from losing a child, but better, functional. She can laugh now, sometimes. That's progress. I'm glad. She talks about you often, about how you helped her, sat with her in her grief, gave her a reason to get out of bed. She wants to do the same for you, if you'll let her." Greta nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. The first year was adjustment, learning to navigate American systems again, American customs, American speed. Greta found work as a nurse at the Houston hospital. The pay was better than Stuttgart. The supplies were abundant. The work was familiar. Leah started school, first grade. She struggled initially with English. The other children were kind but curious, asked questions about Germany, about the war, about things a 6-year-old couldn't possibly explain. But she adapted. Children always did. By Christmas, she was speaking English fluently, playing with neighborhood children, becoming American in ways that made Greta's heart ache and soar simultaneously. In January 1956, Sergeant Franklin Ashford visited the Whitmore farm. He'd retired from the military, worked now as a civil engineer in Houston. He came for Sunday dinner, brought his brother. Nathaniel Ashford was 40 years old, tall, quiet. He designed bridges for a living, built connections between places that had been separate. He shook Greta's hand and his grip was warm, steady. "Franklin's told me about you, about Camp Hearn, about your courage." "I wasn't courageous. I was just trying to survive." "Sometimes that's the same thing." They talked over dinner, about engineering, about nursing, about the strange paths that brought people together across impossible distances. He asked if he could write to her. She said yes. The courtship was slow, careful. Letters exchanged weekly, dinners once a month, walks along Buffalo Bayou where Nathaniel explained the mathematics of bridge construction. And Greta listened fascinated by the poetry of it. Building connections, spanning distances, creating paths where none had existed. He proposed in June 1957. Took her to the bridge he'd designed over the San Jacinto River, showed her the calculations, the stress points, the way weight was distributed so that the structure could hold. "That's what marriage is," he said. "Distribution of weight, two people holding each other up, sharing the load, building something that can withstand pressure." She said yes. They married in September 1958, small ceremony at the courthouse. Franklin as witness, Silas and Miriam in attendance, Leah as flower girl taking her role very seriously. Nathaniel adopted Leah legally, gave her his name, treated her like his own daughter in every way that mattered. Greta became an American citizen in 1960, took the oath with tears streaming down her face. She was German, would always be German, but she was American too now, both things simultaneously. The war had taught her that identity wasn't singular, that you could carry multiple truths at once. Years passed, good years, hard years. The normal accumulation of a life lived. Leah graduated high school in 1967, went to nursing school, following her mother's path, building on the foundation Greta had laid. Silas died in 1970. Heart attack in the cotton field, quick, relatively painless. Miriam found him under the live oak tree. The sapling they'd planted in 1946 was now massive, 24 years of growth. Its branches spread wide enough to shade half the yard. The funeral was small, just family and close friends. Greta stood beside Miriam at the graveside and held her hand, while they lowered Silas into Texas earth. "He loved you," Miriam said quietly. "Thought of you like a daughter. Especially after Thaddeus, you gave him purpose, gave him hope that kindness mattered." "He saved me," Greta replied. "Both of you did. When I expected cruelty, you gave grace. I wouldn't have survived without that." Miriam squeezed her hand. "We saved each other. That's how grace works. It's never one direction." In 1972, Miriam followed Silas. She'd been declining for months. Cancer, liver. By the time they caught it, there was nothing to be done except manage pain and wait. She died on a Tuesday in March, surrounded by family. Greta held one hand. Franklin held the other. Leah sat at the foot of the bed, 23 years old now, strong and capable in everything Annalisa might have been if the world had been kinder. The funeral was larger than Silas's. Miriam had touched more lives, taught Sunday school, volunteered at the library, been the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and brought casseroles when someone was sick. Greta stood at the graveside, 54 years old now, and watched them lower Miriam into the ground beside Silas. She thought about the first time she'd met them. 29 years ago, a German prisoner afraid of everything, and they'd given her work, given her kindness, given her a path back to humanity. After the service, people gathered at the farm. Food, stories, the rituals of remembrance. Greta found Franklin standing under the oak tree, the one they'd planted in 1946. It was massive now, trunk thick as a barrel, branches spreading 40 feet in every direction. She loved this tree, Franklin said. Used to sit under it every evening. Said it reminded her that growth was possible even after loss. Greta touched the bark, felt the roughness under her palm. This tree had been a sapling when she left Texas in 1946. Now it was ancient, solid, proof that time moved forward even when you thought you'd never heal. "I should have come back sooner," she said. "Should have visited more." should have been here. You were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what you needed to do. They understood that, never held it against you. Leah appeared with a small girl holding her hand. 3 years old, blonde curls, blue eyes. Mama Annalisa is tired. Can we go home? Greta looked at her granddaughter, named for the sister she'd lost, named for the hope that love could outlive death. That memory could become blessing instead of curse. Yes, sweetheart, we can go home. But first, she needed one more moment, one more goodbye. She walked to the porch, sat on the steps where she'd sat so many times before, preparing meals, talking with Miriam, finding her way back to herself piece by piece. In her pocket, she carried something she'd kept for 29 years. The Christmas envelope, the one Sergeant Franklin had given her that first week at Camp Hearn, the one that had held her mother's letter and Annalise's photograph. She pulled it out now, yellowed, creased, the red wax seal long since broken, but she'd kept it, through everything, through Germany and divorce and return and marriage and citizenship and all the years that followed. Kept it as a reminder of the day she learned that mercy was real, that enemies could become family, that transformation was possible even when you thought your shape was fixed forever. She turned it over in her hands and Franklin sat beside her. You kept it. Always. It was the first kindness, the first crack in the wall I'd built. I needed to remember that moment when everything changed. Do you ever regret it, coming back, leaving Germany? Greta thought about Stuttgart, about the ruins, about Annaliese's grave that wasn't really a grave, about Werner and his bitter meetings and his refusal to let the war end. No, Germany is my past, America is my future, both are true, both matter, but I had to choose where to raise my daughter, where to build my life, and I chose here, chose this. She gestured to the farm, the oak tree, the fields, the sky impossibly wide and blue. I chose the place where people taught me that kindness was stronger than hatred, that forgiveness was braver than revenge, that you could lose everything and still find reasons to hope. Franklin nodded slowly. Catherine would have liked you, my fiancée, the one who died. She believed the same things, that grace was a choice, that you could decide every day to be better than your worst impulses. They sat in comfortable silence. Around them people were leaving, saying goodbyes, promising to stay in touch, the rituals of ending and beginning. Leah appeared with little Annalisa. Nathaniel followed carrying coats and purses. Ready, Mama? Greta stood, looked one more time at the farm, at the oak tree, at the land that had taught her how to live again. Yes, I'm ready. They drove back to Houston as the sun set, Texas sky painted in oranges and purples and reds. Leah talked about her job at the hospital, about the patients she was treating, about the difference she was making. Nathaniel held Greta's hand across the front seat, solid, present, the man who'd built bridges for a living and had built one for her too, a path from enemy to family, from prisoner to citizen, from broken to whole. Little Annalisa fell asleep in the back seat, her breathing sudden even. Greta looked at her granddaughter in the rearview mirror and felt something settle in her chest. This was why she'd survived, not for herself, for this, for the next generation, for the chance to break the cycle of hatred and build something better from the ruins. Annalisa was dead, would always be dead. The guilt would never fully leave. But this child, this living, breathing, beautiful child carried her name and her memory and the hope that love could be stronger than loss. That night, after everyone was asleep, Greta sat on her porch in Houston and thought about the long road that had brought her here. From Norfolk Dock in 1943 expecting hell, to Camp Hearn finding mercy, to the Whitmore farm learning grace, to Germany confronting ruins, to Texas again choosing hope, to this moment, this quiet suburban street, this ordinary miracle of a life rebuilt from ash. She thought about all the questions that had circled in her mind that first night at Camp Hearn, the 7 mysteries that had seemed so urgent then. She'd survived. That question had been answered. Annalisa hadn't. That answer had broken her. The envelope had held exactly what it promised. News from home. Hope measured out in careful doses. Franklin had looked sad because she reminded him of Catherine. Of love lost too soon, Miriam had shown kindness because she'd chosen healing over bitterness. The ideology had been lies, all of it, every word, and her future. Her future had been here, in America, in Texas, in the choice to believe that transformation was possible. The wisdom she'd earned was simple but hard-won. That the human capacity for kindness was stronger than any propaganda. That you could hate the war and still honor the warrior. That enemies were just people who'd been told different lies. That mercy was the most dangerous weapon ever invented because it disarmed you completely. That survival wasn't betrayal. It was responsibility. To live well, to love fiercely, to build something beautiful from the wreckage. That the dead stayed with you. Always, but they didn't have to be weights, they could be wings. If you let them. Greta stood and walked to the small garden behind her house. Nathaniel had helped her plant it. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, a small oak sapling that would take 50 years to grow massive like the one at the Whitmore farm. She touched it gently, felt the life pulsing underneath the bark. Growth was slow, healing was slow, but they were happening. Every day, every year, roots going deeper, branches spreading wider. She was 54 years old, half her life lived in one country, half in another. Both halves essential, both halves true. The war had tried to destroy her, had destroyed millions, had burned cities and murdered children and unleashed horrors that would echo for generations, but it hadn't destroyed everything. Kindness had survived, love had survived, hope had survived. And standing in her garden in Houston, Texas on a quiet spring night in 1972, Greta Schneider understood finally, completely the lesson America had taught her 29 years ago. That you didn't give mercy to the enemy because they deserved it. You gave it because you needed to prove that humanity was stronger than hate. That grace was braver than revenge. That transformation was always possible if you were willing to let your certainties die so something truer could be born. She went inside, kissed her sleeping granddaughter's forehead, climbed into bed beside Nathaniel, closed her eyes, and dreamed of oak trees growing tall, of bridges spanning impossible distances, of 3 generations of women standing in sunlight, of Annalise smiling somewhere beyond reach but never beyond memory, of enemies who became family, of prisons that became sanctuaries, of the long, slow, painful, beautiful journey from fear to hope. She had expected hell on that August morning in 1943. She had found instead the possibility of redemption, and in the end that made all the difference.